Relative clauses then. So this is something that many people think of as quite difficult, quite complicated, but it's actually remarkably simple when you break it down into the steps that we're going to look at in the rest of this presentation. So what is a relative clause? A relative clause is a specific type of subordinate clause. When we look at writing a sentence, we look at the main clause and then subordinate clauses. A main clause is something that makes sense on its own. For something to be a sentence, it needs to have a subject, which is a type of noun, and a verb. We then have subordinate clauses which don't make sense on their own, and a relative clause is a particular type of subordinate clause. It's used to add information about a noun in a sentence. One of the other types of subordinate clause we look at in Year 5 and then in Year 6 is parenthesis. The difference with a relative clause is that it's just to add information about a particular noun in your sentence. Your relative clause must begin with a relative pronoun, and we use the following four: who, which, whose, and that. Sometimes you will see other examples of relative pronouns, particularly whom. This is a slightly complex one that people aren't always sure how to use though, so we stick to these four. As with most of these things, it's better to make it simple but do it very well rather than try and be too complicated and end up making a bit of a mess of it. We use who and whose when we wish to add detail about a person, or in some cases perhaps an animal. But we use which or that when we wish to add detail about an object or a thing. So how do you use a relative clause then? A relative clause can only be used in the middle or at the end of a sentence. It would not make sense at the beginning because you can't give additional information about a noun if you haven't already used it in a sentence. You can't tell me more about a noun until you've told me what the noun is, so therefore it must come in the middle or at the end. We use the same punctuation as we do with a piece of parenthesis, and that's commas, brackets, and the dashes. If your relative clause is in the middle of a sentence, you will need a pair of commas, a pair of brackets, or a pair of dashes. If your relative clause appears at the end of your sentence, you would only need one comma, one dash, but you always need two brackets because they always come in a pair. Just as with a normal subordinate clause or a piece of parenthesis, if you remove it from the sentence, that sentence should still make sense on its own because it would be a main clause. This is the easiest and simplest way to check your work when trying to use a relative clause, and it's a very simple tip that you can always use. So let's look at some examples to see how this actually works. We have an ordinary sentence. The football had been kicked over the fence. I'm going to look at the football, which is the subject of this sentence. It's one of the nouns in there. It's the subject, who or what the sentence is about. Because this is the subject of the sentence, I can add my relative clause to add extra information. And here we go. The football, which was bright orange, had been kicked over the fence. That's my relative clause. It's marked by a pair of commas. We sometimes, when we're beginning this, describe it as a drop-in clause, as though you could just drop it in and then remove it afterwards. So which was bright orange is giving extra information about the football. I've got my relative pronoun which is used to describe an object in this case, which is the football, and it makes perfect sense now, and it's got the correct punctuation. Nice and simple. Let's look at a different example now then. Time the sentence reads, the doctor gave me some medicine. Again, nice and simple. I'm going to look at the doctor, which is the subject of the sentence. rather than medicine, which is the object in this case. Now I've got the doctor who had treated me before gave me some medicine. We have a relative clause in the middle of the sentence. It's marked by a pair of dashes, and we've used the relative pronoun who because we're giving extra information about the doctor, and the doctor is a person, so we must use who or whose, and it's who, which makes better sense in this sentence. Again, if I removed that relative clause, the sentence still makes sense as a main clause on its own. And finally, one more example. Sentence currently reads, he walked in and closed the door. This time, however, we're going to look at the door. Now, the door is a noun, and it's actually the object of this sentence. We begin by talking about this person walking in, and then it's the door that's closed. It's the object of the sentence, but we can still add additional information about it, as follows. We've got a sentence that reads, he walked in and closed the door that had been repaired yesterday. We've used a pair of brackets to mark the relative clause at the end of the sentence. Now that's important because having it at the end after the word door shows us that the additional information is about that noun and not about the person. We've also used the relative pronoun that, which is one that we know is used to add extra information about an object or a thing rather than a person. Once more, if you removed that from the sentence, it would still make sense as it did before. Hopefully that's a little bit clearer now for anybody who's forgotten any of their previous work on relative clauses. It's very simple, but a very useful way to improve your writing. And hopefully if you're going to have a go at any of the writing challenge work that's on the website for this week, then you might be able to use this to help you with that. Best of luck with that. And remember, you can get in touch with us using that email account if you have any further questions or want to know anything more about this. Best of luck.